A few years back, I was driving a long-haul route across the Midwest. I'm a trucker by trade, been doing it for over a decade now, and I've seen some strange things out on the road. But there was one night I'll never forget. I was heading west through Nebraska, having started out in Des Moines earlier that day. I wasn't in any rush, just a standard delivery, nothing urgent. The weather was fine, clear skies, a bit of a breeze, and the traffic had thinned out by the time I hit the long stretch past Lincoln. It was the kind of route where you could go hours without seeing another vehicle once you got out into the open. It was a long night, and I'd been driving for most of it. My eyes were getting heavy, so I decided to pull into a rest stop off I-80, somewhere between North Platte and Ogallala. It was one of those isolated places where there's nothing but fields around for miles. The only light came from the few dim overheads scattered across the parking area, flickering faintly as bugs buzzed around them. You know the type of rest stop I'm talking about. Basic, no frills, just a few parking spots, some picnic tables, a vending machine that probably hadn't worked in years, and a restroom. I wasn't expecting much, just a spot to get some shut-eye for a few hours. When I pulled in, there was only one other vehicle parked in the lot, another semi, off to the far end, with the driver's side door wide open. At first, I didn't think much of it. Maybe the guy stepped out for a smoke or something, or maybe he was in the restroom. I parked a little further down, turned off my engine, and stretched in my seat. The silence hit me immediately. No cars passing by on the highway, no wind, just the distant hum of bugs and the occasional creak of my truck settling. After a minute or two, curiosity got the better of me. I kept glancing at that other truck, wondering why the door was still open. I didn't see anyone around. The cab looked empty from where I sat. Normally, I'd mind my own business, but something felt off about it. I don't know if it was the way the door was hanging open, like it had been left in a hurry, or the fact that there were no other cars in the lot. But something didn't sit right. I decided to check it out. I grabbed my flashlight from the glove compartment and stepped out of my rig. The night air was cool, and the gravel crunched under my boots as I walked over to the other truck. I shined my light into the cab, calling out to see if anyone was there. No response. The cab was empty, but it wasn't just empty. It looked like someone had been living out of it. There were personal belongings scattered all over the place. A duffel bag half-zipped on the passenger seat, clothes spilling out of it, a half-eaten sandwich on the dash, a pack of cigarettes left open. It was weird. People don't usually just leave their stuff like that, especially with the door wide open. I felt a bit uneasy, like maybe I shouldn't be there. I backed away from the truck and gave one last look around the rest stop. Still no sign of anyone. I figured whoever it was would be back soon enough. Maybe they had an emergency or something. So I headed back to my own truck, climbed inside, and locked the doors. I wasn't going to worry about it too much, just wanted to get a few hours of sleep and get back on the road. I leaned back in my seat and closed my eyes. But sleep didn't come easy. Something about the whole situation kept gnawing at me. I tried to shake it off, telling myself I was overthinking it. After all, weird things happen on the road all the time. Truckers are a strange breed, and you see all kinds of odd behavior out at these rest stops in the middle of nowhere. Just as I was starting to doze off, I heard a noise. At first it was faint, like footsteps on gravel, slowly circling my truck. I opened my eyes, trying to listen closer. The footsteps stopped. I sat up and looked out the window, but I couldn't see anything in the darkness beyond the faint glow of the parking lot lights. I waited for a minute, my heart beating a little faster now, but everything went quiet again. I told myself it was nothing, maybe just the wind or an animal wandering around. but then I heard it again. Footsteps, closer this time. Whoever it was, they were moving around my truck, slow and deliberate, like they didn't want to be noticed. I glanced at the side mirror, but all I could see was the dark outline of my trailer, nothing behind it. I reached for my flashlight and flicked it on, shining it out the window. Nothing. Then I noticed something strange. On the side of my truck, near the door, there were these markings. Strange, like scratches or smudges. I hadn't seen them when I parked, and they hadn't been there earlier. I leaned in closer, trying to get a better look, but before I could make out what they were, there was another sound. A faint creak like metal shifting coming from the back of my trailer. I grabbed the flashlight tighter and got out of the cab. My boots hit the gravel, and I immediately felt that cold, sinking feeling in my gut. I walked around the side of the truck, shining the light ahead of me, scanning the area. Still nothing. But when I reached the back of the trailer, I noticed the door was slightly ajar. I swear I had locked it. I never leave it open, especially when hauling a load. I reached out to close it, but something stopped me. A noise, this time louder, came from behind me. I whipped around, shining the light across the parking lot, but I didn't see anyone. The other truck, the one with the open door, was still sitting there, untouched. I felt like I was being watched, but no matter where I looked, there was no one. The rest stop was completely empty, or so it seemed. I locked the trailer door and quickly got back into the cab, locking myself in. My heart was racing now, and I could feel the adrenaline starting to kick in. I sat there in the driver's seat, gripping the steering wheel, trying to calm myself down. It's just nerves, I thought. I've been on the road too long. Need some sleep, that's all. But the footsteps, they weren't in my head. I heard them clear as day circling my truck. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was out there, watching me, waiting for me to let my guard down. I don't know how long I sat there, staring out the windshield, waiting for something to happen. It felt like hours. The rest stop was still as silent as ever, and the other truck remained empty, its door still wide open like a bad omen. I kept checking my mirrors, scanning the lot for any signs of movement, but everything was still. Finally, as dawn started to break, I decided I'd had enough. I wasn't going to stick around and find out what was going on. I turned the key in the ignition, ready to leave, but as the engine roared to life, I noticed something that made my stomach drop. All 4 of my tires were slashed, deep, clean cuts like someone had taken a knife to them while I was sitting there in the cab. I got out to inspect the damage, but there was no point. I wasn't going anywhere. The rest stop was still deserted, and whoever had done this was long gone. But then I saw it. On the payphone near the restroom, the receiver was hanging off the hook, swinging gently in the breeze. And stuck under my windshield wiper was a small piece of paper. I didn't want to pick it up, but I had to. My hands were shaking as I unfolded it. It was just one sentence, scrawled in messy handwriting. Nothing more, nothing less. The words were burned into my brain for a long time after that. I never found out who did it or why. There were no cameras at the rest stop, no witnesses, nothing. I called for help, waited for the tow truck to arrive, and got the hell out of there as soon as I could. I never stopped at that rest stop again. Hell, I avoid that entire stretch of highway whenever I can. Too many bad memories. A couple of years ago, I was on a solo road trip through the mountains. I'd been working nonstop for months and decided to take a break. It was one of those spontaneous decisions. No set itinerary, just me, my car, and the open road. I packed a few essentials, threw them in the trunk of my old Honda, and set off from Denver. The plan was to head west through the Rockies, maybe loop around through some small mountain towns, and then eventually wind up somewhere in Utah before making my way back. I wasn't in any hurry, and I figured I'd stop along the way whenever I felt like it. The first couple of days were great. The weather was clear, the roads weren't too crowded, and I was enjoying the peace and quiet. I'd find random spots to pull over, take in the views, and occasionally snap a photo. There's something about driving through the mountains that just clears your head. It's easy to get lost in your thoughts out there, especially when it's just you and the road. I was a few hours into the third day of the trip, driving along a more remote stretch of highway, somewhere between Leadville and Aspen. It was late afternoon, and the sun was starting to dip behind the peaks, casting long shadows across the road. I hadn't seen another car for at least an hour, but that wasn't too unusual in this part of the state. I was cruising along, enjoying the solitude, when I spotted something up ahead, a car on the side of the road with its hazard lights blinking. It was a small sedan, kind of beat-up looking, and it was pulled off onto the shoulder. At first, I figured the driver had broken down or maybe had a flat. But as I got closer, I noticed something that immediately made me feel uneasy. The car's driver's side door was open, and there was shattered glass all over the ground. That's when I saw the blood on the dashboard. I slowed down and pulled over a little further up the road, just out of sight from the broken-down car. My first instinct was to stop and help, but something about the whole scene didn't feel right. I stayed in my car for a moment, trying to figure out what to do. I hadn't seen anyone walking along the road, and there didn't seem to be anyone around the car either. The blood didn't look fresh, but I couldn't tell for sure from where I was sitting. I got out of the car, but I didn't go too far. I walked toward the other vehicle slowly, keeping my distance, just trying to get a better look without getting too close. When I reached the back of the car, I could see inside more clearly. The front seat was a mess. There was more blood on the steering wheel and what looked like a broken cell phone on the passenger seat. The airbags hadn't deployed, so whatever happened wasn't from a crash. I stood there for a minute, trying to make sense of it. Should I call the cops? Should I try to find whoever was in the car? I didn't want to jump to conclusions, but the whole situation felt wrong. I pulled my phone out of my pocket, but as expected, in the middle of nowhere, I had no service. That's when I heard a noise. It was faint at first, like the sound of an engine in the distance, but it was getting closer. I turned around and saw headlights coming up the road behind me, moving fast. It was the first car I'd seen in a while, and for a second I was relieved. But as the car got closer, I realized something was off. The driver wasn't slowing down. In fact, they were speeding up. The car, a black SUV, pulled off onto the shoulder just behind my Honda, blocking me in. The driver's side door opened, and a man stepped out. He was tall, maybe in his late 30s or early 40s, wearing a baseball cap and a worn jacket. He didn't say anything, just stood there for a moment, looking at me and then at the car with the broken glass. There was something in his eyes that immediately put me on edge. He wasn't concerned, he wasn't curious. He looked, I don't know, satisfied, I guess. It's hard to explain, but I knew right then that something bad was about to happen. I slowly backed up toward my car, keeping my eyes on him the whole time. He started walking toward me, not in a rush, just steady, deliberate steps. As he got closer, I saw that he was holding something in his hand, a tire iron. My heart was racing at this point, and my first thought was to get the hell out of there. I turned and ran for my car, fumbling with my keys as I tried to unlock the door. I managed to get the door open just as I heard his footsteps speeding up behind me. I jumped into the driver's seat, slammed the door shut, and locked it. My hands were shaking so badly that I almost dropped the keys, but somehow I got the engine started. As I glanced in the rearview mirror, I saw him standing just a few feet away, that tire iron still in his hand, and this twisted grin on his face. I threw the car into reverse, backed up just enough to clear the SUV that was blocking me in, and then peeled out onto the highway. I didn't look back. My heart was pounding in my chest as I sped down the road, my mind racing with a million thoughts. What the hell had just happened? Who was that guy? And what the hell happened to the person in that other car? I drove for what felt like an eternity before I finally found a gas station, pulled over, and called the cops. When they showed up, I told them everything. The broken down car, the blood, the guy with the tire iron, all of it. They took my statement, and then one of the officers went back to check out the scene while another stayed with me. I was shaken up, but I tried to keep it together. After about an hour, the officer who had gone back to the scene returned. He didn't say much, just that the car was still there, but no one was around. No sign of the man I'd seen, and no sign of whoever had been in the broken-down car. They didn't find anything that could explain the blood or the shattered glass either. The phone in the front seat was smashed beyond repair, and there was nothing else that gave them any clues. The cops took my information and told me they'd be in touch if they found anything. But honestly, I don't think they ever did. I never heard from them again, and I didn't bother following up. I just wanted to forget the whole thing and move on. But every now and then, I think about that night, and I wonder what the hell was really going on. After that, I cut my road trip short. I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd narrowly avoided something terrible. I drove straight back to Denver the next day, and for a while I didn't go anywhere alone, especially not at night. I've done a lot of driving since then, but I'm more cautious now. Anytime I see a car broken down on the side of the road, especially in a remote area, I think twice before stopping. It's not that I don't want to help. I do, but you never really know what you're getting into. That night changed the way I think about being out on the road alone. There are a lot of good people out there, but there are also people who are just waiting for the right moment to take advantage of someone like me, someone who's just trying to do the right thing. What really gets me, though, is that I'll never know who that guy was or what he wanted. Was he the one responsible for the blood and the broken glass? Was he waiting for someone to stop, just like I did, so he could do whatever he had planned? Or was he just some random creep who happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time? I've replayed that night in my head 1,000 times, wondering if I could have done something differently, if there was something I missed that could have explained it all. But every time, I come to the same conclusion. There was nothing I could have done. Whatever happened before I got there, and whatever was going to happen if I hadn't left when I did, it wasn't something I could control. A few years ago, I had a really close call on the road that I still think about sometimes, even though I've tried my best to forget it. I've been a truck driver for almost a decade now, mostly hauling freight across the Midwest and parts of the South. You meet all kinds of people on the road, most of them good folks just trying to do their jobs or get where they're going. But every once in a while, you run into someone who sets off alarm bells. This one night, it was a lot worse than that. I was on a route from Kansas City to St. Louis. It was just a typical job. Hauling some general goods, nothing too valuable or interesting. I had left Kansas City in the late afternoon, and by the time I hit the interstate, it was already dark. I'm used to driving at night. In fact, I kind of prefer it because there's less traffic, and the road just feels more peaceful. I had my usual setup going, a playlist of podcasts and some snacks to keep me awake. It was a little after midnight when I passed Columbia, Missouri. The road ahead was dead quiet. No cars, no lights other than the occasional truck stop sign glowing in the distance. I was making good time, and I figured I'd push through for a couple more hours before pulling over for the night. It was the kind of night where the interstate feels endless, just mile after mile of darkness and that hypnotizing hum of the road. That's when I saw the lights in my rearview mirror, a car coming up fast behind me. I didn't think much of it at first. It's not uncommon for people to speed out here, especially at night when the highways are empty. But as the car got closer, I could see it was a sedan, and it was flashing blue and red lights like an unmarked cop car. I immediately slowed down, figuring they wanted me to pull over. My first thought was maybe I'd missed a speed limit change, though I was pretty sure I hadn't been going too fast. I signaled, pulled over to the shoulder, and put my hazard lights on. I wasn't nervous. This kind of thing happens sometimes, and I've never had any real trouble with the law. I figured I'd be polite, answer whatever questions they had, and be back on the road in no time. The car pulled up behind me, and I saw a man get out. He was wearing what looked like a police uniform, but as he got closer, something seemed off. His uniform was wrinkled, like he'd been wearing it for days, and he wasn't wearing a hat or anything official-looking. It was just him, his flashlight and his badge, which didn't look quite right to me. I stayed in my cab, waiting for him to come over. My window was rolled down just a crack, enough to talk but not wide open. He came up to my door and asked for my license and registration. His tone was off too, not the usual direct but polite way cops usually speak. He sounded annoyed, almost aggressive, and I immediately felt uneasy. I asked what the issue was, and he muttered something about needing to inspect my truck. Now this raised red flags. I've been pulled over before, and unless you're doing something really wrong, cops don't usually care about your cargo. They might ask a few questions, maybe check your logbook, but they don't just randomly inspect your load unless they have a reason to. Still, I didn't want to make a scene, so I handed over my license, figuring it was better to just get this over with. The guy took my license and walked back to his car, but he didn't get inside. Instead, he opened the trunk of the sedan and seemed to be fiddling around in there for a minute. I kept my eyes on him through the side mirror, wondering what the hell he was doing. He wasn't calling anything in, which was another weird thing. Whenever I've been pulled over, the first thing they usually do is run my info, but this guy didn't even look at his radio. After a couple of minutes, he came back to my truck, and that's when I noticed he was holding something in his hand. It looked like a crowbar, and my heart skipped a beat. There's no way a cop needs a crowbar to inspect a truck. My gut told me right then and there that this wasn't a cop. Something about the whole situation was wrong, and I needed to get out of there. He knocked on the side of my truck, and I leaned out the window just enough to ask what was going on. He got real close, closer than he needed to, and told me to step out of the truck. That's when I felt the panic start to set in. My instincts were screaming at me to lock the doors and drive, but I didn't want to provoke him if I was wrong. For a second, I hesitated, thinking maybe I was overreacting. Maybe this guy was legit, but I couldn't ignore the bad feeling in my gut. I told him I wasn't comfortable getting out of the truck, and that's when his whole demeanor changed. He slammed the crowbar against the side of the truck, hard enough to make a loud bang. He didn't say anything, just stood there glaring at me. My mind was racing. I didn't know if he was armed, and I didn't know what he wanted, but I wasn't going to stick around to find out. I slammed the window shut and locked the doors. He started yelling, pounding on the door now, but I didn't care. I threw the truck into gear and floored it, swerving back onto the highway. My heart was racing and my hands were shaking as I sped down the road, my eyes glued to the rearview mirror. For a second, I thought I'd gotten away, but then I saw his car's headlights behind me. He was following me, and he wasn't slowing down. I pushed the truck as fast as I could, but semis aren't exactly built for speed, and that sedan was gaining on me fast. My mind was spinning. I didn't know what this guy's plan was, if he wanted to rob me, kill me, or what, but I knew I couldn't let him catch up. I grabbed my CB radio and called out for help. I didn't care who was listening. I just needed someone, anyone, to hear me. I kept repeating my location, telling anyone on the channel that I was being followed by a guy pretending to be a cop. My voice was shaking, but I didn't stop talking. I just kept going, hoping someone was close enough to help. After what felt like forever, I finally got a response. Another trucker somewhere up the road said he was nearby and heading my way. I can't tell you the relief I felt just hearing another voice, knowing I wasn't alone out there. I kept driving, trying to put as much distance between me and the sedan as I could. Eventually, I saw the lights of another truck up ahead, parked on the side of the road. I recognized the company logo. It was the guy who'd answered my call. As I got closer, the sedan behind me suddenly swerved off the road and disappeared into the night. Just like that, he was gone. I kept driving for a few more miles before pulling over at a truck stop. The guy who'd helped me pulled in behind me, and we talked for a bit. He hadn't seen the sedan himself, but he'd heard everything over the radio. He said I did the right thing by getting out of there and not engaging. I didn't call the cops right away, mostly because I wasn't sure what to tell them. The guy hadn't actually done anything other than try to get me out of the truck, and by the time I would have called, he was long gone. I figured it would be more hassle than it was worth, and honestly, I just wanted to get some rest and put the whole thing behind me. I kept driving through the night, but I didn't stop again until I reached St. Louis. The whole time I kept glancing in my mirrors, half expecting that sedan to pop up again, but it never did. By the time I made it to my drop-off, I was exhausted, both mentally and physically. I parked my truck, grabbed a quick nap in the cab, and then finished the delivery. I never saw that guy again, and I hope I never do. But I've thought about that night a lot since then, wondering what would have happened if I'd gotten out of the truck or if I hadn't been able to get away in time. I don't know what he wanted, and I don't care to find out. The road is dangerous enough as it is without people like that out there, trying to take advantage of drivers who are just doing their jobs. About 2 years ago, I had an experience on the road that I still can't fully wrap my head around. I was driving a route through the Nevada desert. If you've ever driven out there, you know how desolate it can be. Long, straight stretches of highway with nothing but sand, rocks, and the occasional tumbleweed. No towns for miles. Just the open desert and a handful of rest stops that feel like they're in the middle of nowhere. Because they are. The night I'm talking about, I was driving along US Route 95, heading south from Reno toward Las Vegas. It's a route I've taken more times than I can count, but it never feels any less isolated when you're out there in the dark, miles away from the nearest bit of civilization. I'd left Reno in the early evening, aiming to make it a good way down the highway before pulling off to rest. The cargo I was hauling wasn't time-sensitive, so I wasn't rushing, but I did like the idea of getting a few more hours behind me before the night really set in. By the time I was a couple of hours out of Reno, the sun had set completely, and the temperature had dropped. It's one of those things about desert driving that always throws me off. How hot it can be during the day and how bone-chilling cold it gets at night. The road ahead of me was empty, just a ribbon of asphalt cutting through the dark. I didn't mind, though. That's one of the things I actually enjoy about truck driving, the quiet. Just the hum of the engine and the road stretching out in front of you. No distractions, no noise, just your own thoughts for company. It was probably around 11 p.m. when I first noticed the truck. I didn't see it at first. It was the headlights that caught my attention in my side mirror. They were far back, just a couple of faint dots in the distance, but I kept an eye on them. Out there, you don't see a lot of traffic at that time of night, so when you do, it stands out. I didn't think much of it at first. I figured it was another trucker, maybe someone hauling through the night to make up time. But after a while, I realized that the truck wasn't passing me even though it was catching up to me. If you've ever driven long stretches of highway, you know the feeling. Someone comes up behind you, they pass, and that's the end of it. But this truck wasn't doing that. It was hanging back just far enough to stay in my mirror, but not so close that I could make out any details. Just the two headlights in the distance, sitting there like they were watching me. I sped up a little, thinking maybe I was just going slower than I thought, but the truck matched my speed, staying just far enough behind me to keep me from getting a good look at it. I remember feeling a little uneasy, but I pushed it to the back of my mind. It's not unusual for drivers to hang back like that. Sometimes they're just pacing themselves or waiting for a good spot to pass. I didn't think it was anything more than that at the time. I kept driving, the miles ticking by, but the truck didn't pass. It stayed there, keeping pace with me. After about half an hour of this, I started to get annoyed. I don't know what it was. Maybe just the fact that it felt like the driver was messing with me. I've been on the road long enough to know that people can be weird out there. But usually they keep to themselves. This felt different. I decided to let it go. I told myself I was overthinking it. And if the trucker wanted to follow me for whatever reason, fine. It wasn't hurting me. I turned up my music and tried to focus on the road. But every time I glanced in the mirror, those headlights were still there, always at the same distance, never getting closer, never falling back. Eventually, I pulled off at a rest stop. It wasn't anything fancy, just a small pull-off with a couple of parking spots and a restroom that looked like it hadn't been cleaned in years. I needed a break, and I figured this was as good a spot as any to stretch my legs and take a piss. As I pulled into the lot, I glanced back in my mirror and saw the headlights following me off the highway. I parked my truck and watched as the other truck slowly pulled into the lot behind me. Now this was where things started to feel really off. There were a couple of other trucks parked in the lot, but they were spaced out, engines off, drivers presumably asleep in their cabs. The truck that had been following me parked at the far end of the lot, a good distance away from the other trucks. Its engine was still running, but the driver didn't get out. I waited for a minute, figuring maybe he was just stopping for a break like I was, but after a couple of minutes, nothing happened. The truck just sat there, engine idling, headlights off. I got out of my cab and stretched, trying to shake off the stiffness in my legs, but I couldn't help glancing over at the truck every few seconds. The lot was dead quiet, and there was no sign of the driver. I debated whether I should just get back in my truck and keep going, but I needed to use the bathroom, and I wasn't going to let some guy's weird behavior stop me from taking care of that. I headed toward the restroom, keeping an eye on the truck as I walked. When I reached the restroom, I hesitated before going inside, glancing back at the truck one more time. The door to the cab was still closed, and there was no movement. I ducked into the bathroom, did my business as quickly as possible, and hurried back to my truck. When I got back into my cab, I sat there for a minute, watching the truck. Its engine was still running, but there was no sign of life. I decided to get back on the road and put as much distance between me and that truck as I could. I pulled out of the lot and merged back onto the highway, glancing in my side mirror as I did. For a moment I thought the truck might stay there, but after a minute or so I saw its headlights come back on and it pulled out of the lot, following me again. At this point I was starting to get really freaked out. I kept telling myself it was just a coincidence, that maybe the guy was on the same route as me and there was nothing more to it, but I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't normal. I sped up again, pushing my truck a little harder than I usually would, but the other truck kept pace, never getting too close, just hanging back in the shadows. This went on for what felt like hours, though it was probably only another 30 minutes or so. Eventually, I couldn't take it anymore. I decided to pull a trick I'd learned from another trucker years ago. I slowed down gradually until I was almost crawling along the highway, hoping the truck would get impatient and pass me. For a minute, it seemed like it might work. The headlights got closer, and I thought the driver was finally going to overtake me. But just as they got close enough for me to make out the shape of the truck, they slowed down too, matching my pace again. At that point, I knew this wasn't some random driver. Whoever was behind the wheel was messing with me, and I had no idea why. I grabbed my CB radio again and put out another call, hoping someone would be nearby. I didn't get an immediate response, but after a couple of minutes, I heard a voice come through the static. It was a trucker heading north on the opposite side of the highway. He told me he'd been listening and that there wasn't much traffic ahead of me, but he'd keep an ear out. It wasn't much, but just hearing another voice made me feel a little better. I decided to keep driving, hoping the guy would eventually give up and leave me alone. But the longer I drove, the more it became clear that wasn't going to happen. Every time I looked in my mirror, those headlights were still there, always at the same distance, never getting closer, never falling back. Eventually I saw a sign for another rest stop, and I decided to pull in, figuring I'd rather be stopped in a place with more trucks around than keep driving alone with this guy following me. As I pulled into the rest stop, I saw there were a few more trucks parked this time, and I felt a little more at ease. I parked near the middle of the lot and watched as the other truck pulled in behind me again, parking at the far end of the lot like before. This time I didn't get out of my truck. I wasn't going to give him another chance to do whatever it was he had planned. I locked my doors, turned off the engine, and sat there watching the other truck. Its engine was still running, but again the driver didn't get out. I must have sat there for over an hour waiting for something to happen, but nothing did. The truck just sat there, its headlights off, engine idling. Eventually, exhaustion started to catch up with me, and I decided to try and get some sleep. I figured if the guy was going to do something, he would have done it by now. I don't know how long I slept, but when I woke up, the other truck was gone. The lot was quiet, and there was no sign of the guy who'd been following me. I didn't waste any time. I fired up my engine and got back on the road, not stopping until I reached Las Vegas later that morning. I never found out who was driving that truck or why they were following me. I told a few other truckers about it later, and some of them said they'd had similar experiences, trucks or cars tailing them for miles only to disappear without a trace. But no one had any answers, just theories. A couple of years back, I was hauling a load of high-value electronics from Dallas to Chicago. It was one of those cross-country runs that you don't mind because the pay is good, but at the same time you're always a little on edge. High-value loads attract trouble, especially if people know what you're carrying. I'm always careful not to talk about the details on the radio or with anyone at rest stops. Too many ears out there. But even when you're cautious, things can go wrong. This trip was one of those times. I had been on the road for about 10 hours already and was making decent time. It was late in the evening, and I was somewhere near Springfield, Missouri, planning to push through for a few more hours before stopping for the night. Traffic had thinned out, and the road was mostly clear, just the occasional semi or car passing by. The weather was fine, clear skies, no wind, and cool enough to keep the AC off and just roll with the windows cracked a little. I was listening to the radio, mostly static with the occasional country song cutting through, when I noticed something odd up ahead. There was a white van pulled over on the side of the road, its hood propped open, and a couple of guys standing around like they were trying to fix something. I've seen a lot of breakdowns over the years, and normally I wouldn't think twice about it, but something about the way they were acting didn't sit right with me. One of the guys was standing a little too far from the van, more like he was watching the road than paying attention to whatever was wrong under the hood. As I got closer, I could see they were watching me. Not in the way people glance at passing cars or trucks, but more like they were studying me. One of them raised his hand like he was going to flag me down, but I wasn't stopping for anything that night. I passed them without slowing down, but I checked my mirrors as I did. The moment I passed, the guy who had been standing away from the van quickly walked back to it, and they both got in. The hood was still up, but they didn't seem too concerned about that anymore. I picked up my speed a little, not wanting to give them any time to catch up. I've heard of setups like this before. Guys pretend to have car trouble, and when you pull over to help, they jump you or rob you. It's common enough that most truckers I know don't stop for anyone unless they absolutely have to. I kept an eye on my mirrors as I drove, expecting to see the van come up behind me at any moment, but it didn't. I figured maybe they had a real problem after all and couldn't follow me. Or maybe they were just trying their luck, and I hadn't fallen for it. Either way, I wasn't going to stick around to find out. I stayed on the road for another couple of hours, crossing into Illinois and feeling a little more relaxed as the miles ticked by. The encounter with the van slipped to the back of my mind. It was getting late, and I was starting to feel the fatigue setting in. I decided to pull into a rest stop outside of Effingham, Illinois. It was one of those basic rest areas, just a couple of parking spots, a restroom, and some vending machines. There were a few other trucks parked there, most of them with their lights off, drivers likely sleeping inside. I pulled into a spot at the far end of the lot, away from the other trucks, and shut off the engine. As soon as I got out of the truck, I noticed another vehicle pull into the lot, an old beat-up van. It wasn't the same white van I had seen earlier, but it was similar enough to catch my attention. I stood there for a minute, watching it park a couple of spaces down from me. The engine stayed running and no one got out. At this point, I was feeling uneasy again, but I tried to brush it off. I needed a break, and there were other truckers around, so I figured I'd be fine. I grabbed my wallet and phone, locked the truck, and headed for the restroom. I did my business and splashed some cold water on my face to wake up. As I was leaving the restroom, I noticed two guys walking toward my truck. One of them was the same guy I'd seen standing by the white van earlier. My stomach dropped. There was no way this was a coincidence. I kept my distance, watching from the side of the building. The two guys were standing near the back of my trailer, talking quietly and glancing around like they were trying to make sure no one was watching. I didn't like the look of it. I was debating whether to confront them or just get back in my truck and leave when one of them walked over to the side of my trailer and crouched down, messing with something underneath. That's when I knew for sure they were up to no good. My truck was carrying nearly $500,000 worth of electronics, and these guys were definitely after it. I didn't know how they knew what I had or if they were just trying their luck, but either way, I wasn't going to let them get away with it. I didn't want to start a confrontation, especially since there were two of them, and only one of me, so I decided to try and get to my truck without them noticing. I started walking around the side of the building, keeping low and out of sight. When I got close enough, I could see that one of the guys was still crouched by the trailer, fiddling with something near the wheels, while the other one stood by, keeping watch. I reached the side of my truck without them seeing me and quietly unlocked the door. I climbed in, locked the doors behind me, and grabbed my CB radio. I put out a call, hoping to reach any of the other truckers in the lot. I didn't get a response right away, but I kept calling, trying to stay calm while I watched the guys from the rearview mirror. After a minute or two, I finally got a response from another trucker parked at the opposite end of the lot. I quickly explained what was going on, and he said he'd come over to check it out. While I waited, I kept an eye on the two guys. The one by the trailer was still messing with something, and I could see him pull out a small device like a power tool. The other guy was pacing back and forth, clearly getting impatient. A few minutes later, the trucker who had responded to my call pulled up next to my rig. As soon as the two guys saw him, they froze. The one crouched by the trailer quickly stood up, and they both started walking away, trying to act casual. I watched them get into the van, and they drove off without looking back. Once they were gone, I got out of the truck and checked the trailer. That's when I found the device they had been messing with. It was some kind of lock jamming tool. They had been trying to disable the locks on my trailer without setting off the alarms. It was a clean, professional job, and if I hadn't caught them in the act, they probably would have emptied half the load before I even knew what was happening. The other trucker and I talked for a bit, and he told me I wasn't the first to have this happen. He'd heard stories about guys in vans following trucks with high-value loads, waiting for the right moment to strike. They work in teams, using these devices to jam locks and alarms so they can steal the cargo without anyone noticing until it's too late. The scary part is how quiet and efficient they are. If I hadn't seen them at the rest stop, I probably would have woken up the next morning with an empty trailer and no clue how they'd done it. After that, I didn't waste any time getting back on the road. I drove straight through the night, stopping only once more for gas before I finally made it to Chicago. The whole time I kept checking my mirrors, half expecting to see that van following me again. But thankfully they didn't show up. Still, it was hard to shake the feeling that they could have. When I finally made the delivery, I told the receiver what had happened. He didn't seem too surprised, which made me think this kind of thing happens more often than anyone likes to admit. I was lucky that night, but I've heard stories of other truckers who weren't so fortunate. Guys who wake up to find their trailers empty, or who get jumped by a group of thieves when they stop to take a break. A couple of years ago, I took a job that seemed routine enough at the time, but it ended up being one of the most unnerving experiences I've ever had. I got a call to pick up a load from a warehouse just outside of Memphis, Tennessee, and deliver it to a facility in Little Rock, Arkansas. It was a late-night pickup, which was fine by me, less traffic on the roads, and I've always preferred driving at night. The dispatcher told me it was a smaller warehouse that mainly handled bulk materials, but nothing unusual. I figured it would be a quick in-and-out job, and I'd be back on the road before sunrise. I arrived at the industrial park around 11 p.m. It was one of those sprawling, poorly lit areas with nothing but rows of warehouses, some of them looking like they hadn't been used in years. The streets were nearly empty, and the only sound was the distant hum of the highway. I followed the directions I'd been given, but as I got closer to the address, I noticed that the area was even more deserted than I expected. Not a single car in sight, no lights on in the nearby buildings, and no other trucks around. When I finally found the warehouse, I immediately noticed how rundown it looked. The exterior was grimy, and the parking lot was cracked and overgrown with weeds. It didn't look like it had seen much use recently. There was a sign out front, half rusted and barely legible. but I could make out the name that matched the one on my delivery paperwork. The loading bay doors were open, and the lights inside were on, but the place still looked abandoned. I pulled up to the side of the building and parked near the loading dock. Normally, at a pickup like this, someone comes out to meet you pretty quickly, either a security guard or a warehouse worker. But there was no one. I waited a few minutes, looking around, but it was dead quiet. I checked my phone, hoping to call the dispatcher, but of course I had no service. I figured I'd get out, take a quick look around, and if I didn't find anyone, I'd just leave. As I got out of the truck, I noticed a strange smell in the air. It wasn't anything overwhelming, just this faint metallic, almost rust-like odor that seemed to hang in the air. It wasn't too unusual. Sometimes industrial areas have weird smells, especially near old factories or warehouses, but it was enough to put me on edge. I walked up to the loading dock and called out, hoping someone would answer, but there was no response. The dock itself was cluttered with empty pallets and crates, some of them covered in dust like they hadn't been touched in weeks. I stepped into the warehouse, shining my flashlight around. The inside was just as grimy as the outside. There were rows of shelving units, most of them empty, and a few pieces of equipment scattered around. The fluorescent lights overhead flickered occasionally, adding to the eerie atmosphere. I kept walking, expecting to find a worker or at least some kind of sign that the place was still operational, but there was nothing. No forklifts moving, no paperwork on desks, just a whole lot of silence. It was as if the place had been abandoned in a hurry. I checked my paperwork again to make sure I was in the right spot, but everything matched up. I was about to head back to my truck when I noticed something on the floor near one of the shelving units. At first, I thought it was just some rags or discarded packing material, but as I got closer, I realized it wasn't. It was a pile of blood-stained cloth, and next to it, a shattered cell phone. The blood wasn't fresh, but it wasn't old either. I felt a chill run down my spine, but I kept telling myself that maybe it was an accident. Someone cut themselves working and just left it there, but still, it didn't sit right with me. I started to get this gnawing feeling that I shouldn't be there. I decided to head back to the truck and figure out my next move. As I turned to leave, I heard a faint sound coming from the far end of the warehouse, near the back offices. It wasn't loud, just a soft creaking, like a door slowly opening or closing. I froze for a second, listening. It could have been the wind, I told myself. But there was no wind that night, and the warehouse was sealed tight. I started walking toward the sound, not because I wanted to investigate, but because my truck was parked near that side of the building. As I got closer to the back offices, the smell I'd noticed earlier grew stronger. It wasn't just that metallic odor anymore. It was something else, something rancid. The kind of smell you only encounter when something's gone really wrong. I reached the door to the office area and hesitated. It was slightly ajar, and through the crack, I could see a dim light flickering inside. I didn't want to go in, but at the same time, I felt like I needed to see what was happening in there. I pushed the door open slowly, and the first thing I noticed was the desk. It was covered in paperwork, but it wasn't organized. Everything was scattered, as if someone had been rifling through it in a hurry. There was a faint buzzing sound, and I looked up to see an old ceiling fan wobbling overhead, barely turning, as if it hadn't been serviced in years. The office itself wasn't very big, just a small room with a desk, a couple of chairs, and filing cabinets. But the smell was overwhelming in there. It hit me like a wave as soon as I stepped inside, and I almost gagged. I don't know why I kept moving forward, but I did, my heart pounding in my chest. That's when I saw the blood. There were splatters of it on the floor leading to the corner of the room where a cabinet had been knocked over. It wasn't a lot of blood, but enough to make my stomach churn. I didn't want to know what had happened in there, but it was impossible to ignore. I backed out of the room quickly, feeling my pulse racing. I rushed back to my truck, my thoughts spinning. I didn't know if I should call the police or just get out of there. My first instinct was to leave, but I felt this overwhelming sense that something terrible had happened in that warehouse, and maybe it wasn't over yet. As I climbed into my truck, I noticed something else that I hadn't seen before. Parked just beyond the far corner of the building, partially hidden by some trees, was a black SUV. Its lights were off, and I hadn't seen it when I first arrived. It hadn't been there earlier. There was no way I would have missed it. I stared at it for a moment, my heart pounding even harder now. There was no movement inside the SUV, no sign of anyone, but it was enough to convince me that I needed to leave. I started the engine and pulled out of the lot as fast as I could, trying not to look back. The moment I hit the main road, I floored it, putting as much distance between me and that warehouse as possible. I drove for at least an hour before I finally stopped at a truck stop just outside Little Rock. I sat there for a while, trying to process what I had just seen. I thought about calling the cops, but what was I going to tell them? That I found some blood in an abandoned cell phone? That I smelled something bad and saw an SUV that didn't belong? I didn't have any real proof that something terrible had happened. And I didn't want to get involved in something I didn't fully understand. I ended up finishing the job and making the delivery the next day, but the whole thing stuck with me. I couldn't stop thinking about that warehouse, about how empty and abandoned it felt, even though the lights were still on and the doors were open. It was like the place had been frozen in time, left behind by whoever had been there before me. I never heard anything about it after that. No news reports, no police investigation, nothing. It was like it never happened. Like whatever went down in that warehouse had been wiped clean. But I know what I saw. That blood, that cell phone, the SUV. None of it made sense, and it still doesn't. I've been back to Memphis since then, but I avoid that industrial park whenever I can. I don't know what was going on there, and I don't want to find out. This happened in 2019. It was a routine trip from Denver, Colorado to Albuquerque, New Mexico. I was hauling a standard load. Nothing valuable, just a bunch of furniture and supplies. I'd done the drive plenty of times before, and it's one of those routes that's mostly long stretches of highway through empty desert and small towns. Not a lot of traffic, and by the time night falls, the road is pretty much yours. I don't mind that. In fact, I usually prefer it. Less distraction, fewer people to deal with. I was making good time, cruising through the dark, with nothing but the distant lights of occasional small towns breaking up the blackness of the desert night. It must have been around 11 p.m. when I saw a car on the side of the highway, hazards blinking. It was one of those older sedans, a little beat up but not ancient. I spotted a guy standing near the front, waving his arms, trying to get my attention as I approached. It wasn't uncommon to see people broken down on those long stretches of highway, especially in the middle of nowhere. I didn't think much of it at first. Normally I wouldn't stop, but the guy looked desperate and there weren't any other cars around. I figured maybe his phone was dead or he couldn't get a signal to call for help. I pulled over a little ways ahead of him, keeping my truck idling, and got out. The guy jogged up to me, looking a little frantic. He was in his late 30s or early 40s, wearing a jacket and jeans, and he looked like someone who'd been on the road for a while. He didn't seem like a threat, just some poor guy stuck out in the middle of nowhere, and I could sympathize with that. He said his car had broken down and asked if I could take a look at the engine. I agreed, mostly just wanting to help him out and get back on the road. As I walked over to his car, I started to get that feeling in my gut. The one that tells you something isn't right. It's hard to explain, but little things were starting to add up. The car didn't look damaged, and the hood wasn't popped open like it should have been if he had been messing with the engine before I arrived. But I pushed that thought aside and figured maybe he was just not too familiar with cars. When I leaned in to check under the hood, things got a lot weirder. There was nothing visibly wrong with the engine. No steam, no smell of oil or gas, nothing to suggest that this car had actually broken down. That's when I heard footsteps behind me. I turned around just in time to see two other men walking toward me, coming from behind the car. They must have been hiding just out of sight. My heart dropped. It was clear at that point that this wasn't some stranded motorist situation. I didn't wait for them to explain themselves. One of the guys had something in his hand. A tire iron, maybe? I didn't get a good look because all I could think about was getting back to my truck. I took a step back, trying to stay calm, but I could see the guy closest to me, the one who'd waved me down, shifting like he was getting ready to make a move. They didn't say anything. They didn't need to. The whole thing clicked in my head all at once. This was a setup, and I had walked right into it. I backed up toward my truck, keeping my eyes on the three of them. They weren't rushing me, which made it worse. They were confident, like they'd done this before and knew how to handle the situation. When I was about 10 feet from my truck, the first guy, the one who had waved me down, made his move. He lunged at me, and that's when everything kicked into high gear. I turned and sprinted the last few feet to my truck, hearing the other two guys behind me, their footsteps pounding against the pavement. My heart was hammering in my chest. I slammed the door shut, locked it, and threw the truck into gear. My hands were shaking, but I managed to get the truck moving, pulling out onto the highway as fast as I could. As I sped away, I looked in the side mirror and saw the three of them standing there, watching me. They didn't try to chase me. They didn't have to. They'd almost gotten me, and I think they knew that. The whole thing had been perfectly timed, perfectly set up. I just got lucky, reacting a second faster than they expected. I drove for miles, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tight my knuckles were white. My mind was racing. I didn't know what they'd planned to do if they'd caught me. Maybe they wanted to rob me, or maybe it was something worse. Whatever it was, I wasn't going to stick around to find out. The next town wasn't for another hour or so, but I wasn't stopping until I was somewhere well lit with people around. I finally pulled into a gas station just outside of Las Vegas, New Mexico. It was one of those brightly lit 24-hour places with a few cars in the lot and a couple of truckers filling up. I parked my rig and sat there for a minute, trying to calm down, but my heart was still pounding. I was drenched in sweat and my hands were shaking so bad I could barely hold my phone. I thought about calling the cops, but what was I going to say? 3 guys tried to jump me out in the middle of nowhere, but I didn't get a good look at them or their car. They hadn't actually done anything, and I wasn't even sure where exactly it had happened. I didn't have GPS tracking on my truck back then, so I couldn't pinpoint the exact spot. It was just another stretch of desert highway with nothing around for miles. After a while, I got out, filled up my tank, and bought a cup of coffee from the station. I felt like everyone was watching me, but I tried to act normal. The cashier probably thought I was a mess, but he didn't say anything. I sat in my truck for a bit longer, drinking my coffee and trying to shake off the adrenaline, but I couldn't stop thinking about what had happened. I kept playing the situation over and over in my head, thinking about how close I'd come to whatever those guys had planned. If I hadn't reacted as fast as I did, if I'd hesitated for just a second longer, they would have been on me. I'd probably be lying in a ditch somewhere. My truck gone. My load stolen. Maybe worse. The thought made my stomach turn. I stayed at that gas station for a couple of hours, just trying to steady myself. Eventually, I got back on the road and finished the trip, but I didn't feel right the whole way. Every time I passed a car on the side of the road, I tensed up. Every time I saw someone waving for help, I sped up. I didn't stop for anything or anyone the rest of the way, and when I finally got to Albuquerque, I was exhausted, both mentally and physically. I never reported it. I figured there wasn't much point. Those guys probably knew the area better than I did, and they were long gone by the time I could have done anything about it. Maybe they'd try the same thing on someone else, but there was nothing I could do about that. I just wanted to put it behind me and move on. I've been back on that route since then, but I always make sure to avoid driving it at night now. The desert is beautiful during the day, but when the sun goes down, it turns into a different place. You realize how alone you really are out there, and that's when people like those guys can take advantage of it. I was making a late-night run from Flagstaff to Las Vegas hauling construction equipment. It was late, well after midnight, when I was on one of those long, empty stretches of road where the landscape is all desert, and the only lights come from the stars above. I had just passed through a small town, probably Kingman or something similar, and hit the open road again. The night was quiet, and I was tired but not exhausted. I'd had a couple of hours of sleep earlier, so I was planning to drive for another hour or two before pulling over to rest for the night. I was cruising at a steady pace when I saw the flashing lights of road construction up ahead. That's nothing unusual, especially out here, where the highways are constantly being repaired. So I slowed down and prepared to follow whatever detour they had set up. I rolled up to the construction site, where a large barricade blocked the road. There were orange cones set up to direct traffic, but it wasn't like there was much traffic to direct. Mine was the only vehicle out there. I saw a sign pointing to a narrow road on the right with a big arrow and the word detour. No other way around it, so I followed the sign. The road they sent me on was much smaller, and I wasn't sure it was really meant for a big rig like mine. It was one of those old roads you see in the desert, barely wide enough for two cars to pass each other, cracked and worn from years of neglect. But I didn't have much choice. The detour sign said it was the way around the construction, so I kept going. The road started to climb, winding up into the hills. The higher I got, the narrower the road became. At first it was just a little tight, but soon enough, I was hugging the shoulder to make sure I didn't drift off the edge. The drop wasn't massive, but it was steep enough to make me nervous, especially in a loaded truck like mine. The weight of the equipment in the trailer made every turn feel like I was pulling a slow-motion balancing act. There was no one else on the road, no headlights in the distance, just the sound of my engine humming in the night. The further I went, the more I started to wonder how long this detour was going to last. It felt like I'd been driving for a while without any sign of the main highway, and I hadn't seen any markers or signs in miles. Just dark hills and desert stretching out endlessly in front of me. Then I reached the bridge. It came up suddenly, and I had to slam on the brakes to keep from going onto it too fast. The bridge was old, the kind that looked like it was made for small cars, not trucks hauling thousands of pounds of equipment. The wood was cracked and worn, and the metal supports were rusted. It wasn't a long bridge, maybe 50 or 60 feet across, but it looked ancient, like it hadn't seen real maintenance in years. I pulled up to a stop right before the entrance and got out of the truck to check it out. The bridge creaked under my feet, and as I walked to the middle, I could feel it swaying ever so slightly in the breeze. The boards beneath me were soft in some places, and the metal cables holding it together didn't inspire much confidence either. The weight of my truck would be pushing it to the absolute limit. For a minute I thought about turning around. But looking back at the road I had just come up, I realized I had no real option. There were no turnoffs, no places wide enough to pull a U-turn, and the road was too narrow to reverse all the way back down. I'd come too far. I had to cross. I got back into the truck and slowly inched forward. The wood creaked even louder this time, and I could feel the weight of the truck pressing down on the boards. Every few feet, the entire structure seemed to groan like it was straining to hold together. I was halfway across when I heard a loud crack, followed by a metallic clank. I stopped. For a moment, I just sat there, my hands gripping the wheel so tight my knuckles were white. The bridge swayed slightly, but nothing else happened. The crack was sharp, and I could tell something had given way under the weight. I looked in my rearview mirror but couldn't see much in the dark, just the faint outline of the road behind me. I took a deep breath and pressed forward, moving as slowly as I could without stopping completely. The bridge groaned again, and another loud crack echoed through the night. I was almost at the other side when I felt the back of the truck dip suddenly. The bridge shook violently. And for a split second, I thought the whole thing was going to collapse. I hit the gas and lurched forward. The back of the trailer scraped against the bridge as it sagged, but I managed to get the front wheels onto solid ground. The moment I was clear of the bridge, I heard another snap. And in the rearview mirror, I watched as the middle section of the bridge collapsed into the ravine below, taking part of the trailer with it. I stopped the truck and jumped out, running to the back to see the damage. The rear of the trailer was hanging off the edge, swaying slightly as the weight shifted. I couldn't believe it. I had made it across, but just barely. If I had been going any slower, or if the trailer had been just a little heavier, the whole thing would have gone down with me in it. I stood there for a while, just staring at the wreckage of the bridge, trying to process what had just happened. The rest of the road stretched out in front of me, winding through more hills, and I realized I was still in the middle of nowhere. I had no idea how much further the detour would take me, and now I had a damaged trailer to deal with. There was no cell signal out here, and the night was so quiet it was almost suffocating. I got back into the truck, trying to put as much distance between myself and that bridge as I could. The road continued to narrow as I climbed higher into the hills, and it felt like the detour was leading me deeper and deeper into the middle of nowhere. I hadn't seen another car, truck, or even a house since I'd taken that turn off the highway. After what felt like hours of driving, I finally saw a sign up ahead. It was an old, rusted road marker pointing back toward the highway. Relief washed over me as I followed the arrow, thinking I was finally getting out of this maze of hills and narrow roads. But the road that led back to the highway wasn't any better than the one I'd been on. It was steep, and the turns were tight, making it almost impossible to maneuver the truck without worrying about going off the edge. My hands were shaking, and my whole body was tense as I navigated the twists and turns. Then, out of nowhere, I felt the truck lurch again. The rear tires slid on the loose gravel, and the whole rig tilted dangerously toward the edge. I slammed on the brakes and sat there for a moment, breathing hard, staring at the drop-off just a few feet away. My trailer was hanging halfway off the road, and I knew that if I moved too quickly or took the wrong turn, I'd go right over the edge. I got out again and looked at the situation. The road was barely wide enough for me to straighten the truck out, and there was no way to reverse without risking the trailer pulling the whole rig over. I was stuck. There was no choice but to try and ease forward, hoping the road would level out before the trailer pulled me over the side. I climbed back into the cab, gripping the wheel tighter than ever. I inched the truck forward, feeling the weight shift with every movement. The road creaked and groaned under the strain, and I could feel the edge of the trailer dragging against the dirt. Every second felt like an eternity, but eventually, the road started to level out. The trailer straightened, and I breathed a sigh of relief as I got back onto solid ground. I didn't stop after that. I kept driving, my hands trembling, my heart racing, just wanting to get back to the main road. Finally, after what felt like hours, I saw the lights of the highway ahead. The moment I hit the smooth pavement of the interstate, I felt like I could finally breathe again. I pulled over at the first truck stop I saw, parked the rig, and just sat there for a long time. I couldn't believe what I'd just gone through, the detour, the bridge, the narrow roads. It all felt like a nightmare, but it was real. I don't know how I made it out of there without losing the truck, or worse. 3 years ago, I drove from Dallas to Phoenix transporting construction materials. I'd done this route plenty of times before, and it's usually pretty straightforward. It was a typical late-night drive somewhere in the middle of New Mexico on one of those long, desolate highways where there's nothing but desert for miles in every direction. I think I was on US Route 60, maybe a few hours past Clovis, heading west. It was late, probably close to midnight, and the road was dead quiet. There were no other cars, no towns nearby, just pitch-black desert and the occasional dim glow of a distant house or ranch. I don't mind driving at night. I actually prefer it most of the time. Less traffic, less hassle. But out there in the middle of nowhere, when you're completely alone, it can get to you. The silence, the darkness, it's like the world just stops. I was cruising along trying to focus on staying awake when I saw something up ahead. At first it was just a vague shape on the side of the road, but as I got closer I could see it was a person. A woman walking along the shoulder. She was barefoot and her clothes looked torn up like she'd been out there for a while. She had long dark hair, and even from a distance I could tell she wasn't in good shape. My first instinct was to pull over and see if she needed help. It was the middle of the night and we were miles from anywhere. No way someone should be walking out here alone, especially looking like that. So I slowed down and pulled off to the side of the road a little ahead of where she was. She didn't react at first, just kept walking like she didn't even notice me. I rolled down the window and called out to her, asking if she needed help. She still didn't say anything, just kept walking, her eyes straight ahead. I thought about driving off. Something about the whole situation felt off. But I couldn't just leave her out there. So I put the truck in park, got out, and walked toward her. As I got closer, I noticed there was something odd about the way she was moving. She wasn't stumbling, but there was this strange stiffness to her steps, like she was in a daze or something. When I finally caught up to her, I asked if she was okay, if she needed a ride somewhere. She finally stopped and turned to look at me. Her face was pale, and she had this blank expression, like she wasn't fully there. I couldn't see any obvious injuries, but there was this dark stain on her dress near her side. It looked like blood, but I couldn't be sure in the dim light. I asked her again if she was okay, and after a few seconds she nodded. Her voice was quiet, almost like she didn't want to speak, but she asked if I could take her to the next town. I didn't feel right about leaving her there, so I agreed. I walked her back to the truck, opened the passenger door, and helped her climb in. As soon as she got into the cab, she just sat there staring straight ahead. I asked if she was hurt, but she didn't respond. I figured maybe she was in shock or something bad had happened to her. I wasn't about to press her for details. My priority was just getting her somewhere safe. I got back in the driver's seat and started driving again. The silence in the cab was heavy. She wasn't saying a word, just staring out the windshield. I tried to ask her a couple of questions, what her name was, where she was headed, but she didn't answer. She just sat there staring ahead with that same blank expression. After a few minutes, I decided to leave her alone. Maybe she just needed time to gather herself. I figured we'd pass a gas station or a small town eventually, and I could drop her off where she could get some help. The problem was, out there on that stretch of highway, there wasn't much of anything for miles. We drove for what felt like an hour, and the whole time she didn't move or say a word. The atmosphere in the truck was starting to get to me. There was something about the way she was sitting there, so still and silent, that made me uneasy. I kept glancing over at her, hoping she'd say something, but she didn't. She just kept staring out the windshield, her hands resting on her lap, fingers trembling slightly. Then I saw the lights up ahead. It was a police checkpoint, one of those temporary setups where they stop cars for routine checks or sobriety tests. I hadn't expected to see anything like that out here, but I was relieved. I figured I could stop and explain the situation, maybe get the police to take her somewhere safe. I pulled up to the checkpoint, and as soon as we came to a stop, I got ready to roll down the window and talk to the officer. But before I could say anything, something strange happened. The woman in the passenger seat started shaking, her whole body trembling. Her hands were clenched into fists, and she was staring at the floor of the truck. I didn't know what to do. She looked like she was on the verge of a panic attack. I glanced over at the police officers, and they were already walking toward the truck. One of them had a flashlight, and he shined it into the cab. I told him about the woman, explained that I had picked her up walking on the side of the road, and that I didn't know what was going on with her. But when the officer looked inside the cab, his face changed. He motioned for the others to come over, and they all gathered around the truck, their expressions serious. The officer asked me to step out of the truck, so I did, figuring they wanted to check everything out. They opened the passenger door, but when I looked back, the woman was gone. The seat was empty. No sign of her. The officers seemed confused, and so was I. There was no way she could have just disappeared like that. I didn't know what to say. I tried to explain again that I had picked her up, that she'd been sitting right there next to me. But the cops didn't seem to believe me. They asked if I'd been drinking or if I was tired. I wasn't. I knew what I'd seen. She had been sitting right there, silent the whole time, and then suddenly, she was gone. The officers searched the area around the truck, thinking maybe she'd slipped out when I wasn't looking, but they didn't find anything. No tracks, no sign of her anywhere. After a while, they told me to get back in the truck and head on my way. They didn't seem too interested in my story, probably figured I was just tired or something. But I knew what had happened. She had been there. I drove off, still trying to make sense of it. The rest of the night, I kept glancing over at the passenger seat, half expecting her to be sitting there again, but the seat was empty. I never saw her again after that, and to this day I have no idea who she was or where she went. It was a quiet night somewhere in northern Texas, along US 287 between Amarillo and Wichita Falls. That stretch of road is endless. Once you're out of the city, there's just miles and miles of nothing but flatlands dotted with the occasional ranch or small town. I had picked up a load of machinery parts in Amarillo and was headed southeast. It was already late, maybe around 11 p.m., and the road was deserted. Just me, the highway, and the faint glow of the moon above. I was in no rush, planning to pull into a truck stop closer to Wichita Falls to sleep for the night. As I was driving, I noticed headlights behind me. It wasn't uncommon, of course. People travel at all hours, but this set of headlights seemed different. I noticed them because they appeared so suddenly. One minute, the road behind me was pitch black. The next, these bright lights were coming up fast. I kept checking my mirrors, waiting for them to pass me, but they didn't. Instead, the vehicle just stayed behind me, maybe a couple 100 feet back, following my pace. It was strange, but I figured they were just taking their time, maybe planning to pass when the road straightened out. A few miles passed, and the truck behind me stayed at the same distance. It was an old semi, no license plates that I could see, which struck me as odd. The truck looked worn, the kind you'd expect to see in a scrap yard or parked for good in someone's backyard, not out on the highway. The lights were dim, too. Not the bright LED kind most trucks have these days, but old, yellowed bulbs. I kept driving, expecting the truck to pass me at some point, but it never did. It just followed, keeping pace with me no matter how fast or slow I went. It was starting to make me uneasy, but I told myself there was probably a reasonable explanation. Maybe the guy was tired or his truck was on its last legs and he didn't want to push it too hard. About 30 minutes later, I pulled into a rest stop to stretch my legs, grab a snack, and use the bathroom. The rest stop was small, nothing fancy. Just a few parking spots, some picnic tables, and a vending machine that probably hadn't worked in years. I was the only one there, or at least I thought I was. As I got out of my truck, I looked in my side mirror and saw the old semi pulling into the rest stop behind me. It parked a few spots away, still with no sign of a driver. At this point, I was feeling pretty unsettled. I stayed by my truck, not wanting to stray too far in case I needed to leave quickly. I glanced over at the other truck, and that's when I realized something that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. The windows were tinted so dark I couldn't see inside, not even a silhouette. But the weirdest part was that no one got out, no movement, no sound. The truck just sat there, engine idling. I tried to brush it off and tell myself it was nothing. I've seen plenty of weird stuff on the road, but this was starting to feel different. I was about to get back in my cab and just drive on, but something made me pause. I stood there for a few minutes, waiting, watching, thinking maybe the driver was just taking his time or maybe sleeping in the back. But the longer I waited, the more I started to feel like I was being watched. There was a small bathroom at the rest stop, so I quickly jogged over, trying to shake off the weird vibe I was getting. I kept my eyes on the truck the whole time, half expecting the driver to step out at any moment, but no one did. I rushed through the bathroom break and got back to my truck as quickly as I could. As soon as I was back inside, I locked the doors and sat there for a moment, just staring at the old semi parked a few spots away. I started the engine and pulled out of the rest stop, my heart racing a little as I got back on the highway. I kept an eye on my mirrors, and sure enough, the old truck pulled out right after me. It stayed behind me, the same distance as before, never getting closer, never falling back. I tried to keep calm, telling myself it was just some guy with an old rig, maybe following the same route as me. But then it got weirder. The truck started flashing its high beams at me, once, twice, then again like it was trying to get my attention. I slowed down a bit, thinking maybe he wanted to pass, but he didn't. The lights kept flashing, and it wasn't like a normal trucker's signal. It was erratic, like someone was flicking the lights on and off at random. I was officially freaked out. I sped up, trying to put some distance between us, but the truck matched my speed, never letting me out of its sight. It was like something out of a nightmare. No matter what I did, the truck stayed right behind me, those dim headlights looming in the distance. I kept driving for what felt like forever, hoping I'd see another car or a state trooper or something. But there was nothing, just miles and miles of empty road. The whole time, the old semi kept following, never passing, never pulling away. I tried switching lanes, slowing down, speeding up. Nothing worked. It was like the driver was playing some kind of twisted game with me. Eventually, I saw a sign for a truck stop up ahead and decided to pull in. Maybe if I stopped somewhere with more people around, the driver would back off or at least stop acting so strange. I pulled into the truck stop, parked near the front where the lights were brightest, and watched as the old truck rolled in behind me, parking a few rows away. I stayed in my cab, pretending to check my phone, trying not to look too freaked out, but inside I was panicking. The truck sat there, engine still running, and no one got out. It was just sitting there, like it was waiting for me to do something. I debated whether I should go inside the truck stop, maybe find someone to talk to, but I didn't want to leave my truck. Something about the whole situation felt wrong, and I didn't want to be too far from the safety of my cab. After what felt like an eternity, the old truck finally pulled out of the lot and drove off. I watched it disappear into the night, those dim headlights fading into the distance. I sat there for a while, trying to calm down, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd just narrowly avoided something bad. I eventually got back on the road, but I didn't see the truck again that night. I made it to Wichita Falls without any more incidents, but the whole experience stuck with me. I've heard stories from other truckers about strange things happening on the road, about people following them or trying to mess with them, but I've never experienced anything like that before or since. I don't know what that guy's deal was or why he was following me. Maybe he was just messing around, trying to scare me for kicks, but it didn't feel like a joke. It felt like something darker, something more dangerous. I still think about it whenever I'm on those long, empty stretches of road late at night, and I make sure to keep my eyes on the mirrors, always checking for those dim headlights. You never know who's out there or what they're planning.